One little introduction to the introduction is that I took no part at any phase of the preparation of this text, so I'm not an expert. I'm in the same position as you are, having 3 afternoons to read it. But it's a very quick reading, and my first impression is that it's a bird's eye view, which is mistaken because starting to read, I've seen this as a huge universe opened in front of us, and the starry skies show galactics and bright stars, which will be pointed out to in this presentation. Fratelli, tutti. It's on fraternity and social friendship. St. Francis heard the voice of God, he heard the voice of the poor, he heard the voice of the infirm, and he heard the voice of nature. He made of them a way of life. The Pope says, my desire is that the seed that St. Francis planted may grow in the hearts of many, ours too. This is a 3rd encyclical of Pope Francis, as we all know. Nowadays, if you want to say something meaningful, you have to be able to tweet it. If you can't tweet it, it's useless. So the Pope decided to offer us at least 2 tweets, if not more. The very day of its presentation, he said, I offer this social encyclical as a modest contribution to continued reflection in the hope that in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship. Before, he even tweeted in a shorter way, saying, the effort to build a more just society implies the capacity of fraternity, a spirit of human communion. The Incipit, the first words, Fratelli, tutti. The Pope says, with these words, St. Francis of Assisi addressed his brothers and sisters and proposed to them a way of life marked by the flavor of the gospel. Of the counsels Francis offered, I would like to select the one in which he calls for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance and declares, blessed all those who love their brother as much when he is far away from him as when he is with him. In his simple and direct way, St. Francis expressed the essence of fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person, regardless of physical proximity. As we see from the first words, St. Francis used this expression, Fratelli tutti, in his admonitions to the Franciscans. I have recuperated from the net because it's not there in the encyclical. Let's read it. Let us, all brothers, look to the Good Shepherd who suffered the passion of the cross to save his sheep. The sheep of the Lord followed him in tribulation and persecution, in insult and hunger, in infirmity and temptation, and in everything else. And for this they received eternal life from the Lord. Therefore, it is a great shame for us, servants of God, that while the saints actually did such things, we wish to receive glory and honor by merely recounting their deeds. The Pope declares also that his inspiration comes from Saint Francis, when he went to meet the Sultan Malik al-Kamil with the same attitude that he instilled in his disciples, saying, among the Saracens and other non-believers, without renouncing their own identity, they were not to engage in arguments or disputes, but to be subject to every human creature for God's sake. 800 years ago, St. Francis urged that all forms of hostility or conflict be avoided, and that a humble and fraternal subjection be shown to those who did not share his faith. And finally, the Pope declares that he was inspired in writing this encyclical by the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib, with whom he met in Abu Dhabi. And they both declared that God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. We have all come across the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. And even here at the Academy, we had a moment of very, very profound discussion on it. The encyclical at the end calls also the other sources of inspiration, other witnesses, which is very, very interesting, how this encyclical is open to every direction. In these pages of reflection on universal fraternity, I felt inspired particularly by St. Francis of Assisi, of course, but also by others of our brothers and sisters who are not Catholics. Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, and many more. Yet, I would like to conclude by mentioning another person of deep faith who, drawing upon his intense experience of God, made a journey of transformation towards feeling a brother to all. I am speaking of Blessed Charles de Foucauld. Blessed Charles directed his ideal of total surrender to God towards an identification with the poor, abandoned, in the depths of the African desert. In that setting, he expressed his desire to feel himself a brother to every human being, and asked a friend to pray to God that he truly be the brother of all. He wanted to be, in the end, the universal brother. Yet, only by identifying with the least did he come at last to be the brother of all. And the Pope adds, may God inspire that dream in each one of us. Amen. Why is this encyclical letter coming to us now? First of all, the Pope says that he was sort of forced to interrupt his writing by the pandemic, which helped him by exposing our false securities, our fragmentation, and our inability to work together. He declares that this is not a complete teaching on fraternal love, but seeks rather to consider its universal scope. And Fratelli tutti is an invitation to respond to God's call with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others. You might remember that was the tweet that I quoted at the very beginning. Attempts to eliminate. For what? Pope Francis hopes that in these times we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity by acknowledging the dignity of each and every human person, So we can see now how he articulates all these numerous numbers, 287. First of all, the introduction we have just seen. He operates in chapter 1 a diagnosis, like for a sick world that is covered with dark clouds. The word is sick because it's a closed world. And there are many numbers here. It's one of the most intense chapters. There are 3 very, very large chapters. And this one here, as a diagnosis, is worth doing this. In chapter 2, he wants to shed light on the dark clouds over a closed world. And a stranger on the road, the Samaritan, is the best light meeting our situation. In chapter 3, he invites us to envisage and engender an open world, totally different, transformed. In chapter 4, he says that this is not possible without a heart open to the whole world, going to us human persons, to our hearts. It all starts there. But then suddenly we are surprised, and probably this is one of the strongest moments in this encyclical. Starting from open hearts, he goes to a better kind of politics, recovering a politics as an expression of love. There will be a very surprising expression there, political love. In chapter 6, he talks about society. The society is such that can live in dialogue, friendship, and also reconciliation. After that, he gets to the chapter 7, indicating again with almost 50 numbers, paths of renewed encounter. This is probably the way we have to study more and make incarnate better. He ends up with religions at the service of fraternity in our world, and makes at the end an appeal which was done in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, offering wonderful 2 prayers, ecumenical prayer and a universal prayer. In terms of us Christians, one of these prayers tells us the secret that God, the Trinity of love, would grant us to live the gospel in such a way that we could be able to discover Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother and sister who makes a new start. So now let's see, perhaps with some more detail, all these chapters, if I am allowed to do so, because even this could be enough, but if you have time, patience, and then we will go further. How is this diagnosis about the sick world articulated? The Pope denounces that the universal fraternity and its development doesn't go smooth. It's hindered. People, many are wounded, discarded, and rejected. The whole humanity finds itself in confusion, isolation, desolation. Dreams like united Europe or integrated Latin America are shattered. And the worst of all, the social sense of belonging to one family, to one world, is or seems to be lost. Even the beautiful expressions like opening up to the world have been used and co-opted gladly by the economic and financial sectors rather than human groups. And a culture has been imposed. Unify the world, yes, but dividing people and nations. And so the individuals find themselves reduced to being simply consumers and spectators. And in the globalized society, we are more neighbors, less family. Although the whole encyclical will be pointing out that becoming true neighbors will transform us to family. And the final statement would be, we are more alone than ever in our history. This sick world is in disintegration. A historical conscientiousness, a transmission of our conscientiousness, is in the shadows. Freedom is now like forgetting about the past and trying to create everything from scratch, everything anew, without depending on the past. Lifestyle, it's a consumerism without limits, in an individualism ignoring and scorning history. Culture, it's a new colonization extended in new forms. And in particular, Querida Amazonia, for example, native peoples, they are losing their very soul, their tradition, spiritual identity, and even moral integrity. You see here one of those clouds that I'm going to just to show that there are people who sow despair. Politics is turned into marketing, a throwaway culture, new forms of slavery, Third World War fought piecemeal, fears and conflicts arising, and moral deterioration. This is all the time chapter 1 about dark clouds over a closed world. People forget that we are all in the same boat and are tempted to isolate themselves. This can never be the way to restore hope and bring about renewal. The path we must follow is being closer to others. It is the culture of encounter. Very intense, semantically very intense, and also poetic expressions that have all the potentials of transformation. But the COVID-19 pandemic has also revived the sense that we are a global community, and we are called to rethink our styles of life, our relationships, the organization of our societies, above all, the meaning of our existence. You see again, also a strong and very important chapter, or part of the chapter 1, about the illusions of being in close communication with the media. The digital world is actually not helping us because the respect for others is also disintegrating. You know, the digital campaigns of hatred, lies and manipulation. But despite these dark clouds, we need to be aware of the many new paths of hope. And a wonderful expression, God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. Love, justice, and solidarity are not achieved once for all. They have to be built day by day. This is why and how Pope Francis calls us to hope and expects us to be open to grand ideals. And here's the chapter 2, which is very important because this is our Christian way of looking at the reality. We want to see it the way God sees it, and we look at it through the glasses of the Revelation. A magnificently chosen chapter 10 of Luke, where the parable of Good Samaritan is a ray of light in the darkness. We all know it. It's about a traveler injured and abandoned on the road. And the people we meet there, of course, show our present-day decision to exclude or to include, as the Samaritan does. These decisions can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. So we are moved and called to expand our hearts to embrace the foreigner and to create a culture in which we can resolve our conflicts, because we all have one Creator. This call to fraternal love comes to us from the whole Revelation. This chapter is also calling upon the Old Testament and other New Testament teachings. Love enables us to create one great family where all of us can feel at home as it emanates compassion and dignity. So I would say it's an indication of a therapy, because as we are tempted to ignore others and not to waste time with the problems of others, because we are run by an indifference to pain, the therapy is to rediscover ourselves as citizens of our own nations, of course, but of the entire world, and to create new social bonds where each and every individual is deeply tied to others, and rebuild the hurting world. And this by identifying with the vulnerability of others, rejecting a society of exclusion, and acting in terms of rehabilitating neighbors. There was one last sentence that this needs to be done starting from below and acting at the most concrete and local levels. You see that the stranger on the road is not avoiding difficulties, but they are also presented as opportunities for growth, and especially for reconciliation that will give us new life. And here's an indication to us also as Redemptorists, to be neighbors to everyone and practice a universal love, able to overcome historical prejudices, belongs to our preaching. But the Pope says that preaching now needs to speak more directly and clearly about the social meaning of existence, the fraternal dimension of spirituality, our conviction of inalienable dignity of each person, and our reasons for loving and accepting. He says, this is the only way to conceive and give birth to an open world, the opposite to the closed one, sweeping away all the dark clouds of our tightly closed world. Still in the chapter 3, he invites us to envisage and engender an open world, starting from our Christian, but not only, conviction that God is universal love. We all are part of it and share it to reach universal fraternity. And such universal fraternity is identified in the encyclical with openness, simple openness. There are no others, there are no them, there's only us. And human beings can live, develop, find fulfillment only in the sincere gift of themselves to the others. They can fully know themselves only in an encounter with other persons. No one can experience the value of living without having real faces to love. This is one of those theopoetic, not only theological, but theopoetic expressions that symbolically communicate energy. The Pope goes ahead by saying that universal openness is rather existential than geographical. And it has to do with our daily efforts to expand our circle of friends. Every brother or sister in need becomes an existential foreigner, to me, to us. And there are persons who are treated as hidden exiles, persons with disabilities, who feel that they exist without belonging and without participating. They are close to us. They might be living in the next house, but they are like exiles because universal openness or closeness is existential rather than geographical. You see another cloud of important things here. I'm just pointing to the invitation to live a true solidarity, which means giving priority to the lives of all over a possible appropriation of goods by few. But here comes something that Father Vidal would like when he talks all his life about the Alphonsian moral theology, that is benignity moral theology. The Pope quotes a Greek word, agathosine, which he also translates into Latin as benevolentia. It's promoting the moral good and the moral goodness, our moral theology, in which no one should remain excluded. And the Pope says we will have peace only when we are able to provide land, housing, and work for all. Real and lasting peace will be possible only on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of the whole human family. And we're in chapter 4, halfway. A heart open to the whole world. Here's the secret where everything is being rebuilt. It's about experiencing social friendship. And we do that when we seek what is morally good and when we practice social ethics because we know that we belong to a universal family. This is why we are called to encounter solidarity and gratuitousness. And since all human beings are brothers and sisters, we need to see things in a new light and to develop new responses. I think this is also the same quotation of Father Marciano, who said yesterday that after COVID-19, he would be tempted and pushed to writing a totally new moral theology with the new data that we have all experienced. Again, talking about heart open to the whole world, the Pope simply says we must do our best to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate those who arrive. And he's very, very specific. To that end, we should increase and simplify the granting of visas, adopt programs of sponsorship, open humanitarian corridors, provide housing, guarantee personal security, grant access to basic services. And here's a statement that is really capable of transforming our lives. This is Fratelli Tutti 134. The arrival of persons who are different from us, such an arrival becomes a gift when we receive them with open hearts and allow them to be true to themselves. He says that this is also in a healthy tension between the global and the local. The local is invited to be open and welcoming, but the global is invited to pay attention to what is limited. Because we are, all humans are limited and yet limitless being. This is a mystery which is played exactly on local and global. And here is, I think, one of the most specific contributions of the encyclical. Chapter 5, very strong and long, a better kind of politics that recuperates politics as an expression of love. But to have a better kind of politics, we need to have politics for the people and with the people. And this is carried out, here is this political love quoted, it doesn't come from the Pope himself. It had been mentioned already by Pius XI in 1929 talking to students, but it's also alluded to in Quadragesimo Anno. The political love in order to integrate the economy into a popular social, cultural, and political project, all of them united. So, the development of a global community of fraternity based on the practice of social friendship on the part of peoples and nations requires a better kind of politics that truly serves the common good. It's different from populism. It is rather popular because it provides everyone with the opportunity to nurture the seeds that God has planted in them. We're at the number 162. And helping the poor in this sense means allowing them to lead dignified lives through work. And the worst poverty in this sense would be to take away work and with this take away the dignity of work. Again, in the field of a better kind of politics, it's all brought back to charity, expressed in personal encounters, including those with the distant and forgotten brothers and sisters. But that would require not only individual encounters, it would require a more efficient worldwide organization to resolve the problems plaguing the abandoned people in poor countries. And here where education, which I am representing now, and upbringing, concern for others, a well-integrated view of life and spiritual growth, all these are essential for quality human relationships. But human dignity has to be put back at the center. That would be the better kind of politics. So, the solution proposed are listed out here in 4 points. First of all, we need to engage, I think also as preachers of the gospel, in promoting popular movements to invigorate governing structures. And here's the beauty of an expression that I love so much. With that torrent of moral energy that springs from including the excluded in the building of a common destiny. Promoting movements. And then moving beyond to social policies for the poor, but never without the poor. And then to reform the United Nations organization, which is a strong claim, or economic institutions and international finance, in order to reinforce the concept of the family of nations, where justice plays an essential role. It's a condition for achieving the ideal of universal fraternity. So much so that politics must not be subject to the economy, nor should the economy be subject to the dictates of an efficiency-driven paradigm of technocracy. We are the family of, I repeat, nations that are animated with a torrent of moral energy that springs from the very fact of including the excluded and building together a common destiny. So this is how the Fratelli, Tutti encyclical calls us to a social and political order, new order, whose soul is social charity. And the Pope urges us to rehabilitate politics as one of the loftiest forms of charity. Here the moral theologians would immediately react by associating this with Optatam Totius, where it is said that the moral theology is called to show up and also illuminate how lofty is the Christian call to bring fruits of charity. Here, politics becomes one of the loftiest forms of charity, when it seeks the common good, of course. And here's the political charity called to, again, to our mind, which is born of a social awareness that seeks the good of all people. Social love, it is so important, so strong, and also so strange to some people perhaps, to be talking about political love, social love, and other things. We need to study and understand that better. But here is something that I like to put under your attention, in front of your eyes. You remember that Saint Alphonsus had written an examen conscientiae for the attorneys, for the lawyers, how they should be acting as representatives of justice. Here the Pope offers this for the politicians, and this is a sort of an examination of conscience. Politicians should ask themselves, how much love did I put into my work? What did I do for the progress of our people? What mark did I leave on the society? What real bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash? How much social peace did I sow? What good did I achieve in the position that I was entrusted? Here's chapter 6. I will now be running towards the end because my time is running over. Although I would have some more slides yet, depending on your quality of resistance. All this, which is the loftiest call, has to be realized in dialogue and friendship in society, and this is chapter 6. Very important and nice to worth reading and nice to be read. Dialogue opens the way to a culture of encounter, so that encounter becomes a passion, a desire, and a way of life. Those who dialogue, they recognize, befriend, and respect other persons. So all these values are summed up in the word dialogue. Approaching, the Pope even had an expression that approaching the other, this is an Evangelii Gaudium, approaching the other with a spiritual vision, it's mystical as an act. Involves mystics. Approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, and finding common ground. This is how it all becomes a way of life, dialogue. And there are all tons of expressions in this context. Unfortunately, my format doesn't allow you, but you can read it, that constructive dialogue occurs between its many rich cultural components. We were talking about a country. So there's a popular culture, university culture, youth culture, artistic culture, technological culture, and so on. You find them all listed out in chapter 6. The Pope also talks about the truth here. It's inevitable, because if we are engaged in a social dialogue, we have to respect legitimate convictions and consents of the others. And in fact, if a society is to have a future, it must respect the truth of our human dignity and submit to that truth, which is a very strong expression. A society is noble and decent for its adherence to the most basic of truths. Relativism always brings the risk that some alleged truth or other will be imposed by the powerful or the clever. So certain enduring values that make for a robust and solid social ethics need to come and be embraced by all, and we all need to submit to those enduring values expressed as truth. Again, talking about dialogue and friendship in society and the art of encounter that transforms our life, he says one of the most important statements: life is the art of encounter. And he compares this to the many-faceted polyhedron, which we very well know from many other expressions of the Pope, poliedro as he says that in Italian. The polyhedron represents a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally eliminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations. This also means finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, of course, those that have no voice. So at this moment, we come to a definition of the term culture that is not an external thing, but it is something deeply embedded within a people, and it's about most cherished convictions and their way of life. Such a culture of encounter implies that we as people should be passionate about, again, meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. And that becomes, it's a sort of a repetition, an aspiration, and a style of life. The Pope becomes even more strong here because he wants that we have to build up an inclusive social covenant, which must be also a cultural covenant. This is because acknowledging others, which gives us joy, implies the ability to recognize that other peoples have right to be themselves and to be different. To be ourselves and to be different, we need to have an inclusive social covenant and a cultural covenant that respects and acknowledges the different worldviews, cultures, and lifestyles. All these coexist in society. Such a covenant also demands the awareness that some things may have to be renounced for the common good. And here he refers to another value taken from St. Paul, like the previous one. You remember agathosine, goodness. Here he goes to chapter 5 of Galatians again, and in the verse 22 calls Christotes, which is simply a kindness. There is a mighty power in the courage of being kind, and a mighty resource to build such a covenant in which we can also renounce. And that is the chapter 7. We're finishing almost. Because after, as we said, showing that dialogue and friendship in society create out of us one human family in a covenant, kindly, in a good way, we need now to see new paths of a renewed encounter, not only the forms that we have learned from the past, but new forms of encounter. First of all, look at the wounds that need to be cured and the peace that needs to be restored. In this case, we also talk about a new synthesis for the good of all. And there are three companions that need to be all of them together always: truth, justice, and mercy. Without these three companions, justice and mercy is not enough. Truth needs to be there too. That allows us to build a real society. Getting people to work together, side by side, in pursuing goals that benefit everyone. And looking at the other, again, in truth, justice, and mercy, we should not be looking at them from the perspective of what they said or did before, but rather to see in them the value that they offer for the promise of the future. It's about reconciliation, which needs to be achieved proactively, recreate a basic sense of belonging. It is a never-ending task. And unfortunately, why is it never-ending? Because inequality comes back again all the time, and the lack of integral human development make peace impossible. But when we start from the least, the last ones, with this capacity of seeing in each one of us the promise of a value, then things open new paths of renewed encounter. Some do not like to be talking about reconciliation because they consider conflict, violence, and breakdown as a normal functioning of the society. And yet forgiveness and reconciliation are central themes in Christianity, because Jesus never promoted violence or intolerance. He openly condemned the use of force to gain power over others. But calling for forgiveness does not mean renouncing our own rights when we are confronting corrupt officials, criminals, and others. To overcome the bitter legacy of injustices, we need to overcome evil with good, which is a teaching of St. Paul. Again, the true reconciliation, which is a new path of encounter, does not flee from conflict. To me, as I read the Pope's texts, this is one of the strongest messages of his whole pontificate. Even theology has been given this task to transform every conflict into a new channel of new synthesis. A real reconciliation is achieved, strange enough, listen carefully, it is achieved in conflict, not outside of conflict. Resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation. Here's a new thing again. The victims should not be asked to offer a sort of a social forgiveness. Forgetting is never the answer. We need to forgive without forgetting, but those who forgive in this way choose not to surrender to the same destructive force which caused them to so much suffering. The chapter 7 excludes were, forever, never again were, exclamation mark, because it's the negation of all rights and a dramatic assault on the environment. So the goal of ultimately eliminate all nuclear weapons is a challenge, of course, but it's also a moral and humanitarian imperative, so much as the death penalty, because it's inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary as penal justice. It is simply inadmissible. The Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. Again, the same is applied to a life sentence, which is called by Pope as a secret, hidden, in disguise, death penalty. This is the last chapter now, because the religions need to find a way how to serve fraternity in our world. And that's based on the conviction that each human person is a creature called to be a child of God. And religions can contribute significantly to building fraternity, because we can share spiritual and moral values and experiences in the spirit of truth and love. We all share an ultimate foundation, openness to the Father of all. And only by living as not orphans, but as children, we can live in peace with one another. A very interesting statement comes here again. Reason by itself cannot establish fraternity. That's probably to say that religions do not have to care. Reason would be enough. No, reason is not enough. Our witnessing to God benefits our societies. And seeking God with a sincere heart helps us recognize one another as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters. And the church, our Christian church, while respecting the autonomy of political life, does not remain on the sidelines in the building of a better world, doing its best to reawaken the spiritual energy that can contribute to the betterment of society. Reawaken the spiritual energy. It's not only about understanding. It's not only about writing books, producing good laws. Reawaken the spiritual energy, that famous torrent that can contribute to the betterment of the society. It's also about us, the religious ministers, partially also the Redemptorists. We must not engage in the party politics. This is the domain of the laity. But we need to be, in a way, inserted in the political dimension of life itself, because it's always about constant attention to the common good. And here comes one of the loveliest statements in the encyclical. If the music of the gospel ceases to resonate in our very being, we will lose the joy of compassion, the tender love of trust, and the capacity for reconciliation, as those who have been forgiven themselves and thus sent forth. We're finishing really now, saying that the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity for us Christians is to be found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Flowing out of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we find the principles of our thought and action as the primacy given to relationship, to the encounter with the sacred mystery of the other. That needs to be remembered. The other has a sacred mystery as a brother and a sister. And the call to universal communion with the entire human family. This is a vocation of all. And the church, being Catholic, because it takes root in every place, from her own experience of grace and sin, understands very well the beauty of the invitation to universal love. Indeed, all things human are our concern. And this is what we state, not only the Marxists. And a very nice surprise in this last chapter is also quoting Mary, the Mother of God, of Jesus, which I think the Muslims can read also with some openness and smile. The Pope says that she was constituted a universal mother. And she, in the power of the risen Lord, wants to give birth to a new world. A world where all of us are brothers and sisters, where there is room for all those whom our societies discard, and where justice and peace in this new society are resplendent. Why is Mary here? That's a good question. I think she belongs to this famous Marian profile of the church, to be at the last place, to care for the most abandoned. And this also belongs to the last gift of Pope Benedict. When talking to the religious, he said, one of the specific dimensions of the religious is to be minoritas. Not to claim to be the majority, but to be able to live in minority and help the minority to grow. This is why here we find this statement. We Christians ask that we be guaranteed freedom in those countries where we are a minority, even as we ourselves promote that freedom for non-Christians in places where they are minority. One of the greatest scandals that we offer, unfortunately, is our being not in unity for 1,000 or more years. So we ask God to strengthen unity within the church. A unity enriched by differences, reconciled by the working of the Spirit. Hearing this call, we recognize with sorrow that the process of globalization still lacks the prophetic and spiritual contribution of unity among Christians. A journey of peace is possible between religions. Its point of departure must be a beautiful expression, God's way of seeing things. Because God does not see with his eyes, God sees with his heart. And that's the way of a religious looking at the world. And giving a right essential worship to God and love for our neighbor. That would be most probably the best synthesis. So sincere and humble worship of God bears fruit not in discrimination, hatred, and violence, but in respect for the sacredness of life, in respect for the dignity and freedom of others, and in loving commitment to the welfare of all. This is about the sacred meaning of human life, about the fundamental values of our common humanity. This will allow different voices to unite in creating a melody of sublime nobility and beauty instead of fanatical cries of hatred. This is still Pope's way of formulating things, not as philosophy, psychology, theology, but theopoetics. As religious leaders, we are called to be true people of dialogue, cooperate in building peace, as Redemptorists, of course, as well, not as intermediaries, but as authentic mediators. Intermediaries gain at least some percentage of their activity, but mediators pay for it with their own persons. This is how we are invited to be artisans of peace, by uniting and not dividing, extinguishing hatred and not holding on to it, opening paths of dialogue and not constructing new walls. And the whole thing is finishing with the appeal for peace, justice, and fraternity. We all had a chance probably to read it and be even touched by it profoundly. In a certain part of the text, both leaders, Al-Tayyib and Pope Francis, summon all mankind, humankind, in the name of God, in the name of innocent human life, in the name of the poor, the destitute and marginalized, in the name of the orphans, widows, refugees, and those exiled, in the name of peoples, in the name of human fraternity, in the name of freedom, in the name of justice and mercy, in the name of all persons of goodwill, in the name of God again, we declare the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, the adoption of mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the method and standard, the culture of dialogue as path, mutual cooperation, reciprocal understanding. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen.